just an unbelievable scene.
There's nothing in the textbook to prepare for a natural disaster of this size.
I don't remember any sense of panic until the water started to rise up into our house.
I could just hear things flapping around. I could hear things hitting the side of the building.
And yet when we got there, it was unlike the New Orleans I'd ever seen.
The car was in the driveway, water was up to the roof in the car, and you lost your partner, and now I feel like I have nobody.
The water is at least 12 feet deep.
My name is Keisha Hale. I was born in the 90s, so it was the stereotypical 90s experience as a child. I just remember that I was from the 8th Ward. And
I'm from the 9th.
Yeah, so I just remember that was big. Where you were mattered. It felt like any other day, if I'm gonna be honest. I remember hurricanes being normal. I don't remember us being up in arms or worried. I remember having a Louisiana history lesson that week at school, and that was the first time I had ever even learned about the levee system. I think for my grandfather and my grandmother at the time, they thought maybe the city was being a little bit overly cautious. At the time, maybe we didn't just have the money to be able to just uproot ourselves then, but we stayed.
Possibly for the first time in its long and storied history, the party in New Orleans is over.
It was about 3 feet of water. It hadn't entered into our home at that point, so everything seemed normal. I don't remember any sense of panic until the water started to rise up into our house. It was happening so fast. I remember my grandfather telling us, okay, we need to try to get the cracks in the house. So like getting towels to put at the doors and the frames, just thinking that, okay, maybe it'll stop. No, this water's rising so fast that these little towels aren't gonna do anything. So we just had to leave. We needed to find higher ground and quickly. So we didn't grab any food, we didn't grab any clothes, we just left. And we started to walk down the street, but the water was rising so fast. There were light posts down, there were trees down, and it was dirty swamp water. So we just had to walk linked arms as slowly as we could. We made it about a block before the water was probably up to here, to my grandmother's chin, and she couldn't swim. And my mother also couldn't swim. As we sat in front of someone else's house, it started to hail, and then the water started to rise again, very quickly. So my grandfather said, we need to go into these people's house. It was a house that we weren't sure if it was vacant. We just knew that we had to go somewhere. So I punched through the glass that was on the side frame of the door to unlock it. We all went into the house, and from that point, the only safe place to go was into the attic. It was rising as we were going up. And that's where we stayed for 4 days.
Troy Carter, member of Congress from Louisiana's 2nd Congressional District, representing New Orleans, the river parishes, all the way up to the capital region. Before the storm, I remember very distinctly speaking with my brother who was playing golf. And I said, man, what are you doing? I mean, there's a storm coming. So what are you talking about? It's beautiful sunshine, everything is fine. I said, no, you need to be getting ready. There's a storm. I know it's sun shining now. And if you recall, the storm had essentially passed, and we were okay. Yeah. And we thought everything's fine. And then the levees broke. In rapid time, we were underwater. The pain associated with people being trapped on rooftops, being at the convention center, and the immediate aftermath of all of a sudden the city being like a bathtub that had just been filled with water.
This city in numerous locations.
When you were able to, I guess, emerge from your home at the time, what was the sight?
It was the most eerie silence that I'd ever heard in my life. There were no bugs, no birds, no insects. It's hard to describe if you haven't been there. It's like a scene out of the Twilight Zone. It was a silence like you wouldn't believe because the whole ecosystem was thrown off. In the immediate aftermath, all you could hear in the air were the distant sound of choppers, bringing rations and supplies in. People were, unfortunately, totally dazed and confused. The feel, the sound was something I have never experienced in my life before, and I hope and pray I never have to experience it again.
When you found out the levees broke,
How could this be? What do you mean the levees broke? I grew up in New Orleans, man. Levees are there to protect us.
right?
You never thought of a levee breaching. It was unheard of. So to think that the levee that I knew as the great protector between me and the Mississippi River my entire life had broken, there was a breach, you can't comprehend that. It was chaos. I mean, it was mass chaos. There's nothing in the textbook to prepare for a natural disaster of this size. Clearly, things could have been done better. The resources could have moved faster. There could have been greater communication. But even with that, it was limited. Everything was out. I mean, where there was limited access to any form of communication outside of emergency communication. There's no way to communicate with individuals. Again, it was an absolute nightmare.
I'm Ted Oberg. I worked in Houston at the time, and Houston and New Orleans are about 5 hours apart, and we would go to New Orleans a lot for any number of things. Sometimes they were good, sometimes there were storms, but this was completely different.
Was this your first storm coverage in New Orleans?
Probably not. As the storm rolls into New Orleans and people are left there with no way out, eventually people had taken school buses. It's their only way of getting out of the city. And they stole them, in technical terms, and they drove, they picked people up all over the city, some of them on highways, some of them in neighborhoods, and they drove to Houston. It took 13 hours to do a 5-hour drive, but they got to Houston, and when people got to Houston, they had opened the Astrodome for evacuees to stay there. And so that was, aside from television and seeing all the things that we saw as the storm rolled in, that was the first sign that this was really different. People in New Orleans don't always leave for hurricanes. You know that.
Right.
So the fact that a couple days after the storm, we're still seeing people leave this city said something to people who know the people of New Orleans, that whatever's going on in that city, that some of what we see and some of which we don't, must be really bad. So I got there September 2nd. Early September in New Orleans is not a comfortable time, ever. It is hot and it's humid. It's not the time that, if you have a choice of when you go to New Orleans, it ain't September 2nd.
Right.
And yet when we got there, it was unlike the New Orleans I'd ever seen. I haven't ever found the right words to describe it. It was a city that had been abandoned by anyone that could, and the people who couldn't were completely without the basic means of survival. There were people who for days had been staying with infants and the elderly on overpasses. The convention center had become a spot of some aid, but not in any organized way. It had been ransacked, but not out of ill intent.
But the water's still...
In some neighborhoods, the water's still chest high or higher, let alone the lower ninth. Couldn't get there. Yeah, man, I mean, people were surviving. And it didn't take long for it to set in that it was incredible neglect. That here we are in a country that has the means to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, couldn't figure out how to get water to people at the mouth of the Mississippi River. It's nothing like you've ever experienced, right? So as a reporter, especially someone who's covered a lot of hurricanes, you pull into town, you sort of figure out where stuff is, right? Okay, well, where's the aid distribution? All right, well, you can go there. Where's the most damage? All right, we'll go there. And typically, hurricanes don't lay waste to entire cities, right? They do damage to a particular spot, and we all go there and we find people who've had these really horrible experiences. This was completely different. All right, so we are in a lawless, flooded city of lost hope, right? So then you get closer in and you see the floods. The floods are still there, and there are still people in these homes. There's not like 100 search crews going to look for people in these flooded neighborhoods. There's no one. There was no one. If it wasn't for neighbors going to find people in those homes, Perkins, there was no one going to look for them in those immediate days. And then in the pictures you see, that these are Houston firefighters who got there probably 4, 5, 6 days after the storm, either on their own or sent by FEMA, and they start going into these neighborhoods. The Elysian Fields exit off I-10 is sort of one of the first exits after the French Quarter. Super close to where everyone's been. And the water was about halfway up the exit ramp. So we parked the trailer with their inflatable boats, and we put in right there. And they didn't know what they were going to find. They knew there were people in the homes. It's a historic neighborhood. These are low-lying homes, sort of shotgun-style homes. You could hear people on their porches. There were a couple people sort of walking through the chest-high water. But right there at the off-ramp is what appeared to be an elderly man face down in the water, bloated, been there for a couple days. And again, the neglect of that. It's someone who loved people and who was loved, and lying there on the flooded street of a great American city with nothing more than a plastic sheet over him to afford this much dignity. But in that moment, there was no space to pick him up, and if they had, there was no place to bring him. The hospitals weren't working, the morgue certainly wasn't working. There's nothing any of us could do except tell the story.
So where do you start?
I think you just start by telling people what you're seeing. But to describe what was going on in that entire city was impossible. So you just start by telling people what you see and what you didn't see. Because what we didn't see was FEMA. In a major city where everyone has a great memory, you can't find, I mean, maybe you can find a couple of people. I've never found anyone who doesn't have at least one fond memory of New Orleans. And yet in those immediate days, for whatever reason, and there's been a lot of great reporting about what those reasons are, we couldn't get people the help they needed.
I moved to New Orleans 8 months before the storm hit, and enjoyed, pre-Katrina New Orleans.
So what was that like?
I remember the days before, especially that Saturday night before was probably one of the nicest evenings in New Orleans in August that you can get.
So it wasn't humid?
There was no humidity. The French Quarter was packed. And meanwhile, we were on TV. We had started our 24-hour coverage at 6 p.m. on that Saturday, which a lot of people thought at that time we were overdoing it. We were accused of overhyping the storm and taking things out of context. At some point in the middle of the night, on that night, again, it had not started raining yet. And I remember when, the mayor and his folks knocked on the door and they said, hey, we talked to this guy at the Hurricane Center and we want to come in and we can be on TV. And at the time, he said he had talked to a dude at the National Hurricane Center. He kept saying this dude. And I got in the anchor's ear from the control room and I said, Max Mayfield, who at the time was the director of the National Hurricane Center, who had advised the mayor to empty the city out. But they didn't call for a mandatory evacuation. As a matter of fact, they wouldn't call for a mandatory evacuation until the next morning at 10 o'clock in the morning.
I heard that call from Nagin and the administration came later than it
later in the morning. It was 10 o'clock, 10:30 in the morning when they held that news conference. It was just starting to rain outside. And so that was far too late for how the system worked. So we had a responsibility and to protect people. As it got closer, the storm got closer, I was sitting in my office and I had to trust the people who had been in the city for a long time. And I had
right, because you had only been there for 8 months.
That's right, I haven't been there, so you got to trust your people. So, and I thank God for having the wisdom to be able to trust the people that knew something. I was watching our meteorologist, Margaret Orr, on television, and she said, if you're going to stay behind, she says, I advise you to leave. Everybody that can leave, if you're in the sound of my voice, you need to leave now. And then she said, if you're going to stay, you're gonna need an axe. She kept saying, you're gonna need an axe. It didn't cross my mind that she was saying, you're gonna need an axe to get yourself out of your attic and come through the roof. Even when a mandatory evacuation still hadn't been called. So I give her a lot of the credit for setting the tone for, you know, what we look like as public servants. By that time,
Kind of late.
it was late. It was late in the day. You know, the highways were already packed. It was bumper to bumper because, again, you know, it was called so late. And so, yeah, there were some that were, you know, pretty much on highways for most of the storm.
When we first heard a storm was coming, we weren't really concerned about it until we heard that it was going to be this big Category 5 or 4 or 5 storm. We had planned a trip to go to Mississippi for the weekend. The day we got there is when the storm decided that it was coming into the Mississippi Gulf Coast. It was coming closer into Mississippi than it was to New Orleans, so everybody started getting kind of worried.
What's the proximity of New Orleans to Biloxi? How far or how long of the drive is that?
An hour, 15 minutes, hour and a half drive. Since the storm was headed right where we were on the Gulf Coast in Mississippi, that we were going to have to evacuate. The next morning, we proceeded out, headed back to New Orleans, actually, and they wasn't letting anybody into the city, so we had to get into the contraflow and head north of, to North Mississippi. And then there was just so many people, so many cars on the road. You kind of eased on in. The storm came through there. The wind was raging, and we were scared. We didn't have any phone service. The phones were dead. My family didn't know where we were by the time we made it to Texas. So all we could hear about was floodwaters. Then we made it to Dallas. Butch wasn't feeling good, so we went back to the hotel where he went and laid down. He never could get back up after that because he started feeling worse as the day went on. After that, everybody was just kind of nervous, didn't know what to do because I knew that I had to find a place for Butch to get dialysis, and so it was kind of calling around trying to find somewhere for him to go. We went to this dialysis unit, and he had a fever, and after the dialysis, he got sick. About the middle of the night, that same night, is when he felt really sick and very high fever. So called the ambulance, and the ambulance came to the hotel and took him to the hospital. They put him immediately, put him in an intensive care unit. As the days went on and Butch wasn't getting any better, he slipped into a coma. And in the middle of the night, and I think I was there by myself, and the nurse came out and got me and told me that they was about to code him because his heart was getting bad. I couldn't move, and I couldn't believe all these things were happening. Like the coding went on a second time, and then a third time. I said no more. They finally called it, so we had to let him go. He passed on September the 12th, almost 2 weeks after the storm. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to turn. You lost your partner, and now I feel like I have nobody. There was a point in time where I just didn't want to live anymore. And then we had to plan this funeral. We couldn't come back to New Orleans for burial because everything was flooded. So we had to bury him in the Dallas area. Somewhere in between there, I did get in the car and drive myself back to New Orleans to come check on the house after the flooding and stuff like that, and came home to a devastating situation where the car was in the driveway, water was up to the roof in the car, and that's what was in the house, about 6 feet of water. After I lost my husband, my parents was evacuated up there to Maryland, and I lost the other right hand in my life was my father. My father died in Maryland. So I had to leave Dallas and go to Maryland. That's when I really felt a despair.
So I don't want to experience having my whole life washed away. After everything I've been through Hurricane Katrina. You know, like, there's nothing that I can face later on in life after losing everything, you know, that could make me feel like I can't get over it. I can't get through it. I know I can get through it because I've been through that.
It has helped taper me a little bit in my assertiveness and aggressiveness as a journalist. Sometimes you just got to go through it to learn it. Faith was so tested, you know, doing some of that, and I'm not quite sure I prayed enough. It did test the leadership skills.
I will tell you, the people of New Orleans, Louisiana, surrounding areas, have a resolve and a resiliency like none other. There should have been, and I hope there still will be, a greater effort to look at the whole picture of the lower Ninth Ward, parts of New Orleans, these parts of areas that hadn't gotten the full attention as some other areas. It's better, but it's not perfect. We've learned a lot in 20 years, but we still have a long ways to go. The storm brought out the worst in some, the best in most.
New Orleans is a great place to live, and we have a lot going for us. The people here, we're just, I don't know how to say it better, but we're just us. I actually love my city.
I don't think we realize what people along the Gulf Coast deal with. And I don't think people on the Gulf Coast realize that other people don't. Because it's such a part of life. In saying all this, I take nothing away from the people of New Orleans, who I think are, I love going, I love the people. I don't think the city is where it wants to be. But to see that this is still a place that has a scar from a storm 20 years ago, and that we forgot them 20 years ago, let's not forget them now. And let's not repeat the same mistakes that we made 20 years ago.